Welcome to Design Downtime, the podcast where we celebrate the joys of living a balanced creative life. I'm your host, Guy Siegel, a design director in Toronto, Canada, and I invite you to join me on this journey as we redefine what it means to be a successful design professional. Let's break free from the shackles of hustle culture and embrace the full spectrum of human experience, because life is too precious to be spent only in pursuit of productivity. Today, I'm excited to talk to Pavel Samsonov. Pavel is a New York-based designer exploring the applications of design as a decision-making framework. Pavel has been a product manager, UXer, design strategist, and user researcher across various industries, and currently builds a design practice at AWS. Off the clock, Pavel uses articles and speaking engagements as an opportunity to explore new ideas and help designers envision better ways of working. Pavel likes to frame design as a job that works on calendar time, not clock time, so the necessity of downtime is a topic near and dear to his heart. Pavel, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Great to be here. It's kind of ironic we're recording this on the weekend, but part of downtime is you take it when you can get
it. Exactly, and I'm off the clock.
Exactly.
So today you want to talk to us about baking.
Yeah, it's, I think, possibly not the most original of pastimes. During the pandemic lockdowns, everyone decided that we're going to bake our own bread, and everyone made their own sourdough. And I don't know any other person like here around me who's really still doing it themselves. I'm the only one who's kept it going. I actually started it a bit later than everyone else because I thought it was too much of a hassle. Yeah, it's turned out that I stuck with it. There's a fun story from very early on in the pandemic when I was just growing my starter, and I wasn't sure, I'm going to make bread with this, and will it work, will it not work? And so I put it in the warmest spot that I could think of to encourage it growing, and that spot was on my audio repeater under the table where I work. And so I was in a call on a meeting. I was sitting there, and suddenly I hear there's a strange smell and there's a strange sound that's happening. After a while, I looked down under my desk and I realized that the sound repeater was on fire, because what had happened was it was too warm. The sourdough starter rose too well. It rose all the way over the lip of the jar, it overflowed, and it short-circuited. And I was like, guys, I need to drop out of this meeting. My computer's on fire. And I explained later what I meant by that, because people were very concerned. And I had to buy new speakers, basically. But, compared to the amount of time that I've spent since then with that starter, I think it's paid off. It's, the cost was not so great, and it's a fun story to tell. That starter actually did die. It turns out that it gets moldy if you leave it for a long time without feeding it. So I've gotten better about kind of backing up my my starter when I go travel. You can dry it out, you can freeze it. You can just put a lot of flour in it so that it becomes more dry and takes a long time to digest it. But yeah, it's something that I've been doing on and off basically for the last, 4.5 years, baking at home, mostly sourdough. I have done occasionally, things like Japanese milk bread. It's much easier to make because you're using, just commercial yeast. It's equally satisfying. The nice thing about sourdough is the loaves look incredible. You can give them as gifts to people. Usually when I, go to someone's birthday, I'll bring them a loaf of bread. Kids love, little breads with cheeses. One of my friends had a child a couple of years back, and my bread was the first bread that kid had. And the look on his face is the most rewarding thing. I was just like, oh, someone truly appreciates my work. It's just fun.
You mentioned that you don't know anyone else who is stuck with baking, post-pandemic. What do you think you did?
One of my friends got me this book for scientific recipes. It's like sourdough by science, I think it's called. And that actually completely changed the game for me as well, because it has recipes that are like slow and steady, but I like to call them lazy, because you mix everything together right at the beginning, and then you don't even do stretch and fold. You just leave it. And the sourdough kind of, because it's much slower, there's more time for the gluten strands to form naturally. And so you don't even need to do any kneading. You just put it on your countertop for like 18 to 24 hours. And that 6 hour margin of error there, it's big enough that you can just show up whenever. And does it look good? All right, put it in the oven. And then you're good to go. And if the bread comes out really nice, take a picture, you put it on your Instagram. If the bread doesn't come out well, you make croutons. So it's really kind of a win-win situation. And I think that's also why I like giving it as gifts to people. If you give them something that is permanent, then they're stuck with it, or they have to throw it out and they feel bad. You give them something edible, they eat it, and if they didn't like it, well, it's gone. It's not an obligation anymore. So either way, it kind of works out. And I think the other thing that's really kept me, into bread making was just the gadgets and the things. Like, I've got lots of different jars of flour now in my drawer. I've got a KitchenAid mixer. I've got a cast iron. I like stuff. I like gadgets. And it's very satisfying to just plug something in, turn something on, that instead of a keyboard and a mouse, you've got kind of like levers and buttons and things like that. It's much more tactile, much more kind of engaging. And it's a great contrast to just, sitting at your computer and clicking on stuff.
So is that really the big draw for you, the fact that there's a tangible physical object as a sort of a reward for your work?
I mean, that's a huge part of it, is you're spending a little bit of time on it. Sourdough, it's not really like more conventional bread baking where you kind of get up in the morning and you say, I'm going to make bread. And then you mix it and it rises in about an hour, and you punch it down and it rises another hour, then you bake it. Sourdough, you kind of have to plan it ahead of time. Sometimes I'll get up and I'll think, oh, I want to have bread next week, and you kind of start planning it out, and okay, it means I need to feed my starter, more regularly for the next couple of days to make sure that it's doubling properly. Then I need to put out the levain overnight, so that I guess activates is a good word for it, or that combines nicely and gets lively. And then you have to do the stretch and fold, and then you do it in the fridge overnight. And then I get up in the morning and, pretty early usually, because you don't want to overproof it. But it's like, the first thing of that day that you do is you make bread, and your apartment smells amazing, and you have fresh bread. And yeah, when you take it out of the oven and you put it on the cooling rack, it feels extremely satisfying to have this tangible thing that, I made it, combined with sort of the variability that I think sourdough introduces into it. You don't really get with, instant yeast or rapid rise yeast, because it's not the same every time. I've had loaves that look incredible, and I've had loaves, even my most recent ones, that were flat and kind of sad. And I think that's honestly part of it, is it's not consistent. It's not, just the same thing every time. You don't know what you're going to get. And so when you do get something that looks great and tastes great, it's very exciting. It's kind of like, hey, I rolled the dice and they came up double sixes, or I won the lottery for not the jackpot, but the $15 one, or whatever it is. So it's just like it's a nice surprise. Then you get to eat it. My wife loves bread too. So during the pandemic lockdown, she was actually in Pittsburgh doing her grad school, and so I flew over to visit her, kind of decked out in a mask and one of those face shields people were wearing for a while, and I had like a loaf of bread in my backpack, and then she put that in the freezer, and then she kind of rationed it out because she was really enjoying it, and then she came back, and now she can have the bread whenever she wants, and it's it makes her happy. It makes me happy to see her happy, but it also makes me happy to have the bread and to eat the bread as well. It's very nice also freezing it, because once you've made it and you're like, that's my great bread, you're not actually committing yourself to, okay, now I have to eat this whole loaf of bread, because it's quite a lot, and people kind of I think maybe feel, oh, it's an obligation, or like I'm trying to not, stuff myself. But yeah, you just chop it up, you freeze it, you take it out, you toast it whenever you want some bread. It's just like very nice in a tactile way, also in a little bit of like a Victorian farmer kind of way, where, oh, going to the store for bread, no, I couldn't possibly. Like, I'm just going to make my own. And it's nice to have something that you're eating on a semi-regular basis be something that you made, I guess.
So it sounds like you created some sort of an ongoing ritual around the bread.
I think that's a good way of describing it. Yeah, it's kind of like a semi-ritual, semi-routine kind of thing, but not in the sense of a commitment, not in the sense of like, oh, I have to do this. Like, oh, it's not a commute, It's just a nice thing to do that. Yeah, I know what the next step is. I know more or less what the kind of the range of outcomes is going to be. And yeah, trying new things and getting better at doing it on my own terms, on my own pace is also something that's always very appealing. That sometimes, especially when I've been at Amazon for 4.5 years now, and especially when you've been somewhere for a long time doing the same thing, you can kind of feel like, oh, you're stuck in a rut. And with the bread, I can do all kinds of new things with it. I can see that the loaves, the rise is getting better, the crust is getting crispier, trying new things. I have this cookbook my wife got me. It's the Village Baker's book, and it's super, super interesting things, people were doing in the 18th, 19th century. Like, there's no central store they would go to. There's one recipe I tried that, like, you cultivate yeast from apples, and you make like an apple bread, just fermented and leavened by the yeasts that are in the apples. Like, what? That's incredible. You did never hear about that. Even during the lockdown, no one was like, oh yeah, I made my yeast from apples. Everyone's just like trying to capture the yeast from the windowsill. So it's the kind of thing where you can try interesting things. And, again, the failure just means that, I have this bread, I can make it into croutons, or you can thicken soup with breadcrumbs. It's basically, not a big deal. But if you succeed, you learn something new, you feel good about improving your skills. And yeah, it's just an excuse to step away from the computer and do something different. And like you say, I think a ritual is a good way of describing it, that for a while you're sort of placing yourself mentally in a different space. And it's not a long-term kind of thing. Like, yeah, it's going to take me at most, 3 days of on and off activity to make this. But it's also not a short-term, like, okay, I'm going to sit down for 10 minutes, I'm going to do something, and then it's done. So it really strikes that balance for me, I think, of it's neither too kind of much of a commitment, but at the same time, it's not too abrupt. Like, okay, I'm going to do this, and then what happens after?
Do you also, as part of that ritual, do you also have your favorite spreads or the favorite way to eat the bread? Or is it, again, it's something you keep experimenting with and trying new things?
I think that kind of question is like, if you ask a designer, oh, what's your favorite color? Well, how am I supposed to answer that? All of the colors are important. For the spreads, honestly, anything. I love making a good sandwich. There's a vendor at the local farmer's market that does wasabi brined pickles, my favorite pickle. So that pickle on a rye or a whole wheat sourdough bread is amazing. You get the spice, you get the crunch, put a little bit of butter or something on it for a little bit of fat, or olive oil with a bit of salt. And I'm not gonna say it's a complete meal, nutritionally speaking, but it's an excellent snack. And then, same thing, farmer's market, you get some cheeses, get some sliced meats. So really, when you're putting it together, it's kind of like, here's all the other people making these things, and this is my bread. Like, I get to feel like I'm, part of that community in a way. Like, obviously not actually, because they're professionals and I'm just kind of messing around in my kitchen. But, it's like all of these things coming together, and I know where one of them came from because I made it.
So did the world of baking sourdough bread also open up more baking for you?
I would say that actually, after getting into sourdough bread, I've started making a lot more pizza. I don't have a pizza stone, so it's kind of a little bit bootleg with regular baking tray and things like that. But I got into the pizza because way back on design Twitter, when that existed, there was this guy, Brian LaRossa. He's also from Brooklyn. He's a children's book designer and illustrator, I believe. And he shared that he had this sourdough pizza recipe that his family makes every week, and he was refining it week after week after week. And I wanted to try it because I got a sourdough starter. It's pretty good, and I tried it. I shared my results with him. He's like, "Oh, that's great." Eventually, he changed his recipe to a regular yeast based pizza because he went to some class where he did it, and it's like, "Oh, these are great results." So now there's two recipes, and I've tried making both, and that kind of got me into experimenting with other recipes, experimenting with my own recipes. So I've incorporated some tricks from Roman pizza all'Italia, which is it's sort of like a square, thick pizza that you'll see here and there. It's not nearly as popular as Neapolitan or New York style, but it's actually my favorite type. And obviously, the bread component there is a much bigger part of it. I've kind of gotten into that as well. I don't make it as frequently as the bread, but it's kind of a nice treat. It's something where you actually want to ferment it in the fridge for about 3 days, even though it's regular yeast, because that extra time still adds to the flavor of the bread or the pizza crust tremendously. Like even 2 versus 3 days is a huge difference. Other than that, I mean, like cakes and buns and things, not really. I think it's a different mind space, maybe. I don't know. Like it's not really something that I do a lot. I've tried making cake specifically before, way back when I was just learning how to cook. It came out okay. Icing is the big pain in the butt. So I think that it's really bread and pizza is the baking kind of range for me. But I cook lots of stuff. So mostly I'm using the stovetop rather than the oven in that particular case. Earlier this morning I was making tortillas, so that's flour. That counts kind of as a bread, but it's stovetop. It's not even they don't even go in the oven.
Do you combine your sourdough baking with I would say the stovetop part of things?
I don't really. I used to have a sandwich press way back in the day, and that was nice because you can really make sure your bread is crispy on the outside, especially for a grilled cheese. The hint is you spread the outside of it with mayonnaise because mayonnaise is just oil and egg basically. So you spread with mayonnaise, and that gives it a really nice kind of toasted crust. But strangely enough, that advice works way better with kind of regular bread, like a loaf you buy from the store. It was really soft and it's really thinly sliced. With a sourdough, you slice it quite thick, or I don't know if you're supposed to or not, but it's hard for me to slice it thinly because it breaks or it bends or whatever. So they're quite thick pieces of bread, and because the crust is also much thicker, you put it on, and like unless you cut it perfectly thin, none of that bread is touching the actual pan. So for grilled cheeses, I usually kind of let the cheese melt in the oven as well. It's just a bit less messy as well.
I know people who are, for example, the previous season of this show, I talked to someone who was very passionate about coffee making, and he really dives deep into the science and experimentation of coffee making. I'm really curious to know when after all this knowledge and experience that you've gathered, when you go out and you have bread outside the house, how big of I'll call it a bread snob are you?
On a scale of 1 to 10, I would put myself at a 7, I would say. I'm not going to go to the store and buy Wonder Bread. Like, even, those the better quality breads, like Dave's Killer Bread is quite good. The Ezekiel, it's like the one where they follow the recipe from the Old Testament and they don't put anything else in. I quite like that one, actually. But most of them are, you can tell that it's mass produced. For bakeries, for actual professionals, obviously way better than mine most of the time. So I don't typically go out and buy bread, but I love baked goods. There's this fantastic bakery in Brooklyn called Winner. Lying out the door throughout the day, like you basically, unless you show up super, super early, you're not going to get anything from them. But everything they make is fantastic. So buns, croissants, things like that, out of this world. And then, of course, whenever we travel, and I'm not gonna bring my own bread, so we're gonna have what's there. Surprisingly, Dutch bread in Amsterdam, fantastic, really great. French, obviously. Italian, obviously. One of the breads that I've looked into making it, and it's kind of ridiculous how much effort you have to put into it, is Borodinsky bread. It's allegedly dates all the way back to the Napoleonic Wars and kind of made in celebration of the Battle of Borodino. I think that's like folk etymology. Like I don't think that's real, but it's this very dense molasses based like rye loaf. I looked at all the things you do to make it, and I'm like, I'm not gonna bother. It's way too much work, and it's also really hard to find in stores. Like you have to go out of your way. Fortunately, there's a big Eastern European community in New York, so Parrot Market or Net Cost, those kinds of stores will have it, but you have to go way out of your way. So there's breads that I really do like that I don't usually even get to buy. My kind of limitation for the complexity I'm willing to go into is there's this way of making rye bread that the Germans came up with in the fantastically named Institute for Fat and Carbohydrate Studies. And I'm like, that is the most magical place on earth. It's called the Detmolder Institute. And they came up with this like several day process where you do very specific blends of the amount of starter and the amount of rye flour you give it and the amount of water you give it to first cause one type of bacteria to multiply, which changes the flavor, and then a completely different kind. So first you make it very watery, and then you make it very dry. In each one of those stages for a specific amount of time with like gram level specific amounts of both water and flour really, really enhances the flavor. And then it's like you have to let it cool for 2 days so that the crumb sets. It's like that's as far as I'm willing to go because it's ingredients based. It's the same stuff. It's just you're going to get a little bit more scientific about how you're going to do it. So this is if someone wants to look up how to do this themselves, it's called the Detmolder process. And there's a couple of websites that have adapted it to kind of a home kitchen because it's designed for industrial bread making where you're doing like massive machines and kilograms and kilograms of that bread. But they've adapted it to making a single loaf or 2 loaves, and you can go and try it yourself.
If there's someone listening to this and they're curious about, what I'm maybe missed their turn and at starting to bake during the pandemic, but now they're curious about it, how would you demystify the process?
I think that, honestly, looking up online how to do it is the easiest thing. There's a lot of kind of mythology, I think, around sourdough. People say, oh, I went to San Francisco and I went to, what's that bakery called? There's the mill, I think it's called. I went to the mill and I bought their sourdough starter, like a jar of their starter, because, they make the best bread and therefore it's going to be the best starter. It was like $10 or $25 or whatever. Nonsense. There's nothing special about the starter that they use. The older the starter is, sure, the bacterial culture might be more complex, but you don't even need to you don't need to live in a particularly yeasty place. You just get some flour from the store, mix it with water, and let it stand the next day, throw out a bunch of it, do the same thing again. You can find instructions for that process anywhere on the internet. And yeah, after like a week, you'll have a starter you can use and it tastes good. And then, it's just if it dies, it dies, make it again. I've had one, as I mentioned, die on me. I've remade it. I've loaned kind of pieces of that out to friends who kind of gave their own baking a shot, and theirs have died, and they've remade it. So it's really not like something that you need to worry too much about. You don't really need any kind of equipment. If you think about it, sourdough baking is like acoustic guitar. I forget what the word for this is. It's like a reverse something. It's on Wikipedia. That, once upon a time, all the guitars were acoustic, and all bread was sourdough. And then at a point in time, we found, electric guitars or commercial yeast, and they've kind of taken over a little bit, because when you say guitar or you say yeast, the thing you're referring to without a qualifier has not changed. But, 10,000 years ago, they were still making bread kind of exactly the same way. They didn't have anything. They didn't have any kind of tools or equipment that you would, maybe think you have to have. You don't need a KitchenAid. You don't need to have, the fancy, copper like bowls or anything else like that. It's just whatever you have at home. Is if you have flour and water, you can get started. And, a little bit of salt, like don't forget to add the salt to the bread, but it's literally just flour, water, sourdough, and salt are the four things that you need to make the bread, and an oven, I guess. You don't even need to have a cast iron. I have one. I happen to have it already before I got into sourdough baking. If you don't have one, there's a very simple steam setup you can do where you put a pan full of water under your pot in the oven, and then as the bread rises, the steam creates a humid environment inside of the oven so that it forms that classic sourdough crust. So you can even do that. And that book I mentioned, Sourdough by Science, it tells you how to do all of that stuff. I was already kind of past that starting point when I got this book, so I didn't use that part of it, but I thought it was quite comprehensive. And then, there's lots of instructions out there for what does it look like if your bread is underproofed? What does it look like if your bread is overproofed? From my experience, you're probably never going to overproof your bread. You should always err on the side of just let it rise for another hour or another 2 hours. I've left things out on the countertop for an extra 12 hours, overnight. And I baked it the next day, and it was still, pretty good rise, great flavor. So you can never really overproof anything. It is a very survivable organism, yeast. So it basically doesn't really die as long as you regularly feed it. Just keep it covered on your countertop. You can put it in the fridge. You can freeze it. And then once you take it out again, it bounces back. The only thing I would say is if you have hangups about throwing out food, you might feel like, this discard, you have to discard a portion of it every day when you feed it. You might be like, I don't want to discard it, but you can use that stuff. I have a big jar of it. I make a cracker with it every once in a while. You just mix it with butter, put some herbs on it, spread it thin, put it in the oven for 40 minutes. And it's honestly way better than any store-bought cracker. Zero effort pretty much to make it. And whenever we make it, we make 2 trays of it, and within a day, it's all gone. So if you're worried about sourdough discard and I'm going to waste stuff, no. It's if you make any kind of pancakes, if you make any kind of crackers, just use that, and it'll actually make it taste a lot better than normal.
That's awesome. Pavel, where can people find you?
So the go-to place would be, I guess, my website, pavelsamsonov.com. I am pretty active on LinkedIn, reasonably active on Blue Sky. If folks have heard of it, recently when Twitter got banned in Brazil, 3 million Brazilian users joined Blue Sky, and now it's as much Portuguese as English, which is very interesting. So the community is growing very quickly in a very international way. And then I write a lot on Medium as well, spavel.medium.com. Some pretty good articles on there recently got featured by the Medium staff in their August roundup. So I do pretty well on there. If you want to read my kind of longer pieces, go there. If you want to take a look at my professional stuff, then pavelsamsonov.com is my kind of portfolio site. And it's got links to wherever I do my writing, and it's got links to my socials, my LinkedIn, my portfolio, case studies, things like that.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for joining us, and I really hope one day to be on the receiving end of your sourdough loaf.
Yes, well, there's plenty of them to go around.
Awesome. Have a wonderful day.
You too. Take care.
This is all for this episode of Design Downtime. Thank you for joining me. And until next time, I hope you enjoy your downtime.